Before their thunderous collapse, the Vikings stood as one of history's most feared warrior cultures. From the mist-shrouded fjords of Scandinavia, they launched longships with dragon-headed prows and struck terror across Europe, ruthless, relentless, and seemingly unstoppable. But behind their savage glory was a world far more complex than the blood-soaked legends suggest. To understand what truly led to their fall, we must first look past the myths and recognize the truth. Most of what we know about the Vikings comes from the terrified victims they raided. The monks, the chroniclers, the conquered, they wrote of horror, destruction, and wrath. But buried within archaeological evidence and even Viking accounts lies a deeper story, one not just of violence, but of transformation. So who were the Vikings really? The term Viking doesn't refer to a specific race or nation. It describes a role, a profession of raiding and conquest, taken up by Norsemen from what is now Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and parts of Finland. Not all Scandinavians were Vikings. Most were farmers, blacksmiths, and traders. But those who boarded ships to plunder foreign lands became part of a feared identity that would haunt Europe for centuries. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from 790 CE to 1100 CE, didn't begin with conquest. It began with ships. Powerful, agile vessels like the Nidam boat gave Norsemen the power to sail across open seas, land on shallow shores, and vanish before an army could form. With these ships, they could go where no enemy expected them and strike before anyone could defend themselves. Their first infamous appearance in history came on June 8, 793. Monks in the peaceful monastery of Lindisfarne, off England's northeastern coast, were praying as the Viking ships approached. The Norsemen stormed ashore, slaughtered the monks, burned the holy site, and dragged survivors into slavery. Churches had long been considered untouchable in warfare, believed to be protected by divine will. But the Vikings cared nothing for Christian taboos. This raid sent shockwaves across Europe, immortalized in the Doomsday Stone as a warning of the horror to come. These early raiders weren't interested in land. They struck fast, stole gold, slaves, weapons, and then vanished back to the sea. England and Ireland were hit repeatedly, and over time the raids became more coordinated and ambitious. Soon, they pushed into mainland Europe. Francia, modern-day France and Germany, was fragmented and vulnerable. Viking longships traveled up rivers, bypassing land defenses. Cities fell easily. To stop them, Charlemagne tried ransoms first, paying to spare towns and recover captives. When this failed, he turned to religion. Christianity, he believed, could civilize the Norse. His forces destroyed sacred Norse groves and altars, forcing conversions. But far from pacifying the Vikings, this only enraged them. They responded with vengeance, escalating the brutality of their raids. Still, Charlemagne planted seeds of change. While his forced conversions failed in the short term, they introduced Christianity to the Norse world, a faith that would later dismantle the Viking spirit from within. By 836 CE, Viking ambitions had exploded. They launched their first major raid into Ireland, bypassing England entirely. Their target wasn't treasure, it was people. Thousands of Irish captives were taken and sold in Scandinavian slave markets, fueling a brutal trade that would last for generations. In 841, they established one of their most important outposts, Dublin. No longer just raiders, they were now settlers. Cities fell not just to plunder, but to occupation. Meanwhile, legendary Viking chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok turned his gaze to the heart of Europe. In 845, he sailed up the Seine River with 120 ships and thousands of warriors, aiming for Paris. Frankish King Charles the Bald scrambled to raise an army, but he was too late. The Vikings burned through the city, capturing and ransoming it for 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, an astronomical sum. Paris had fallen not by siege, but by terror. By 850, the Vikings were no longer seasonal raiders. They stayed through the winters in England and Ireland. They built outposts, raised children, and buried their dead on foreign soil. Their reach extended into Germany, into Spain, even into the Mediterranean, where they clashed with Arab powers at Seville and were finally repelled in 859. Yet their hunger wasn't only westward. In the east, under the warrior Rurik, Viking forces moved into what is now Ukraine, laying the foundations for the Kievan Rus. In 860 they reached the gates of Constantinople with 200 ships, ravaging villages and burning towns. Though the city's mighty walls held firm, the damage around them was brutal. The Byzantines were caught off guard, their army deployed elsewhere, and the Viking raiders left rich with loot, if not with conquest. But even for these brutal warriors, the world was changing. Cities were no longer helpless. Fortifications were improving. Defenses were organized. Wealth was moving, not just through plunder, but through trade, politics, and alliances. As the Viking path grew more dangerous and less profitable, the seeds of their transformation had already been sown. By the mid-9th century, the Viking way of life had already begun to change, not by conquest but by settlement. The warriors who once vanished into the mist now stayed. They built homes, grew crops, raised families. Across England, Ireland, and parts of Europe, Norse raiders became landowners, farmers, and husbands. Slowly, the brutal edge of Viking culture dulled, not by defeat, but by transformation. The shift wasn't just cultural, it was political. Power in Scandinavia, once loosely held by chieftains and warbands, began to centralize. Kings emerged, carving out domains, enforcing laws, and raising taxes. Raiding was no longer a personal pursuit. It became regulated, controlled. A Viking couldn't just take his longship and set out anymore. He needed approval. He needed to pay tribute, and for many, it wasn't worth it. Back home, the population was growing. Land was scarce. Farming replaced raiding as the more secure way to survive. If you left to raid, you risked losing your land while you were gone. And if you returned empty-handed, you had no wealth, no safety, and no future. Raiding also grew, more dangerous. Fortified towns, trained militias, and coastal defenses made surprise attacks harder. What had once been fast and lucrative became long, costly, and often fatal. More and more Vikings stayed put, raising livestock instead of burning villages. But it wasn't just economics that eroded the Viking Age. It was faith. Christianity, once mocked by Norse warriors, had become impossible to ignore. The early attempts by Charlemagne had failed, but the idea had taken root. Missionaries came not with swords, but with promises of order, peace, and divine favor. At first, few listened. Viking culture was steeped in Norse mythology, gods of thunder, war, and trickery. They believed in fate, in battle glory, in Valhalla. But power spoke louder than gods. By the 10th century, kings realized that Christianity wasn't just a religion. It was a political weapon. Across Europe, Christian rulers were uniting, organizing, and creating alliances. Pagan kings stood alone. For those who wanted to be seen as legitimate, powerful monarchs in the European world, there was only one option: convert, and many did. The moment a king accepted baptism, his people had little choice but to follow. Churches replaced shrines, crosses replaced hammers. Slowly, the gods of Odin, Thor, and Freya faded from the landscape. Their stories became folklore, their temples ruins. But conversion wasn't just political, it was cultural. Christianity brought new rules: forgiveness over revenge, peace over bloodshed, mercy over fear. Viking raiders, once defined by their brutality, now faced a new doctrine, one that condemned the very thing they had built their world upon. Still, some clung to the old ways. In 865, two Viking leaders, Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan, led the great heathen army into England. Their mission: vengeance. They captured York, avenged the death of their father, Ragnar Lothbrok, and installed a puppet king. But their victory was short-lived. In 871, the legendary King Alfred the Great countered, pushing them into the region known as Danelaw. There, many Vikings did something once unthinkable. They stayed, they farmed, they married, they blended in. This pattern repeated again and again. Raids gave way to settlements. Raiders became residents. In 911, Frankish King Charles the Simple struck a deal with Viking chief Rollo, granting him land in return for peace. That land became Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen. Rollo swore fealty, converted to Christianity, and raised his children as Frankish nobles. By 950, the Viking flame was flickering. Major trade hubs like Birka in Sweden were in decline, not from destruction, but disuse. The world didn't need raiders anymore. It needed merchants, kings, and alliances. The great Viking cities still stood. The ships still sailed. But the heart of the Viking Age, the wild, bloody, lawless spirit, was dying. Then came 1066, the final year of the Viking Age. From Norway, one last warrior king rose, Harald Hardrada. A seasoned soldier and ambitious ruler, he sought to reclaim the Viking legacy in England. With 200 to 300 longships and nearly 15,000 men, he joined forces with Tostig Godwinson, brother of England's King Harold. Together, they defeated a local force at the Battle of Fulford Gate and captured York. But their victory was short-lived. As they rested, King Harold Godwinson led a surprise march north, catching the Vikings off guard at Stamford Bridge. Exhausted and unarmored, many Norse warriors didn't even have time to reach their weapons. The battle was swift and brutal. Both Hardrada and Tostig fell. A chronicler later wrote that the river near Stamford ran red with Viking blood. That day marked the true end, not just of a battle, but of an era. The age of the Viking warrior had ended in blood and fire. What remained were farmers, merchants, and kings, men who looked more to Rome than to Valhalla. The end of the Viking Age didn't come with a final war cry or a burning city. It came silently, slowly, and intimately. It came through marriage, through family, through the soft, relentless pull of a different life. Once Viking warriors sailed to distant shores to raid, pillage, and vanish into legend. But over time, many of them stayed. They met women. They married. They raised children. In Ireland, England, and even deep into Eastern Europe, Viking men stopped being conquerors and became fathers. And with that, the very idea of Viking began to dissolve. You see, Vikings were not a race or a nation. They were a culture, a way of life. And that life depended on chaos, on leaving home, on taking what wasn't theirs, on living by the sword. But once a Viking man owned land, had a family, paid taxes, and walked to church on Sunday, he was no longer a Viking. He was just another European. And unlike the empires of Rome or Persia, the Vikings never tried to impose their values on others. They didn't build monuments to Odin. They didn't demand tribute in Thor's name. They didn't care what you believed, as long as you had gold to take. That's why their settlements weren't temples to Viking greatness. They were ports, trading hubs, temporary shelters that slowly became permanent towns. And once those towns took root, Viking identity faded. Even in their homeland, Scandinavia, the transformation was irreversible. Once a land of independent warriors, it had become a patchwork of growing kingdoms. And those kings? They weren't raiders. They were politicians, landowners, and Christians. Christianity, the faith once despised by Viking warriors, became the final nail in their cultural coffin. At first, Christian missionaries were ignored or slaughtered. Their ideas of forgiveness, of humility, of peace had no place among men who worshipped gods of war and thunder. But over generations, Christianity crept in, not with force, but with favor. Powerful kings saw that aligning with the Christian world meant access to wealth, trade, and legitimacy. So they converted. And when a king converted, the people followed. Whether by choice or by pressure, Norsemen traded in their runes for crosses, their myths for scripture, and their feasts for sacraments, and Christianity changed everything. Suddenly, raiding wasn't just dangerous, it was sinful. Taking monks as slaves wasn't strategic, it was heresy. Worshipping Odin wasn't tradition, it was blasphemy. And if you wanted to be taken seriously in the new Europe, you needed a Christian name, a Christian wife, and a Christian grave. Even the warrior's heaven, Valhalla, was replaced with visions of eternal salvation or damnation. So the Viking soul was broken not by battle, but by belief. Meanwhile, back in the villages, the reality of daily life crushed the last sparks of adventure. As centralized monarchies grew stronger, fewer men had the freedom to raid at will. Tributes and taxes grew. Going on a raid wasn't a heroic act anymore. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. Worse, if you left for too long, someone else might claim your land, and raids themselves had changed. Once wild, reckless, and thrilling, they became organized military campaigns, sanctioned by the state, commanded by noblemen, and carried out by trained soldiers. The heart of the Viking, raw, unpredictable, bloodthirsty, was gone, and with no more raids, there were no more Vikings. Just Scandinavians. Some still tried to resist. Some clung to the old gods, the old ways, the old glories. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. Churches rose where longhouses once stood. Missionaries baptized children who had never even heard of Thor. The sagas became stories. The stories became legends, and the legends faded into history. Yet even in death, the Vikings left their mark. Their shipbuilding shaped naval warfare for centuries. Their language influenced English and other European tongues. Their tactics transformed how battles were fought. And their spirit, the boldness to cross oceans, to challenge empires, to defy fear, still echoes in the DNA of the modern world. So yes, sex, love, and religion ended the Vikings. But in truth, it wasn't weakness that destroyed them. It was transformation. A warrior culture melted into the very lands they once terrorized, not with defeat, but with change. They became part of the world they once attacked, and in doing so, they disappeared. The dragon-proud ships no longer sail. The axes are buried, the gods are silent, but the legacy of the Vikings, that still rides the wind.